It all started with a stranger in my bathroom, but it ended with an HOA empire crumbling. It was the third time in 2 days that a total stranger had walked into my bathroom, but this time she was wearing a silk robe, holding an empty wine glass, and humming a Beyoncé song. I was brushing my teeth. She looked at me like I was the intruder. "Oh," she blinked unbothered. "Did they not tell you we'd be staying here?" I spat out foam and tried to find the part of my brain that handled words. She introduced herself as Fiona, said she was one of Patricia's people, and asked where the towels were. Patricia, as in Patricia Delman, our HOA president who once fined a man for wind chimes and had a meltdown over someone's Halloween doormat. I told Fiona this was my house. She laughed, assumed I was the caretaker, and handed me her keys to go move her car. It would have been hilarious if I wasn't standing in boxers holding a toothbrush, watching a tipsy stranger treat my private bungalow like a spa suite. I stepped outside, half-dressed, walked past the valet sheet she apparently hired, and saw 5 other people dragging luggage toward my front step. That's when I understood Patricia had gone completely insane. I knew she'd always had this weird superiority complex. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was our self-appointed social monarch. But this time, she'd crossed into delusion. Apparently, while I was away for a few days visiting my brother, she'd told the HOA board that my bungalow was technically available for executive guest use under a little-known community charter clause. There is no such clause. What she cited was a landscaping easement rule that allowed temporary contractor access for maintenance, which somehow she'd twisted into hosting, right? She framed it as a community hospitality gesture and never even thought to ask me. Or maybe she knew I'd say no and decided to skip that part. Either way, 5 strangers were now inside my home sipping sparkling water and connecting their phones to my Wi-Fi. I called Patricia. She sent me to voicemail. I drove straight to her place, which of course sits at the front of the gated community like a crown jewel, and knocked with the kind of persistence that usually earns a lawsuit. She opened the door in yoga pants, smiling like this was all just a charming misunderstanding. "Oh, you're back," she said, sipping cucumber water. "It's just a few days. They're visiting from the city, and the rental they booked fell through. We couldn't just leave them stranded." I told her they were in my bedroom. She didn't blink. "Technically," she said, "your bungalow is on HOA integrated land. It's all part of shared equity space." That sentence made about as much sense as a dog applying for a mortgage. I told her slowly and clearly that I was going to evict her guests by nightfall and change all the lock. She dropped the smile. "If you make a scene," she said, "you'll force the board to take formal action. That wouldn't be ideal for anyone." That's when I knew this wasn't incompetence or overreach. It was war. I went home, politely, told the guests there had been a mistake and gave them until sundown to leave. One of them tried to tip me. The woman from the bathroom, Fiona, finally believed I wasn't the property manager when I pulled out a stack of utility bills with my name on them. They packed quickly, muttering things like, "This place is weird, and we should have just stayed in a hotel." By sunset, I had my house back. I changed the locks. I installed a camera system. I emailed the HOA board a deed map showing the precise boundaries of my property, complete with the original survey document. I cited every legal line of exclusion that protected my home from communal use. No one replied. Instead, over the next 48 hours, I received 3 separate emails from the HOA. The first warned me about unapproved security fixtures. The second accused me of blocking community access to a shared utility node, which I assume meant my gate. The third claimed that my newly installed fence violated the visual harmony aesthetic clause. That clause, by the way, had never once been enforced in the 6 years I'd lived here. Meanwhile, Patricia began telling neighbors that I had graciously opened my home for community use and that my recent aggression was due to personal stress. Her lies spread fast. A neighbor I barely knew dropped off a bottle of wine and a thank you card for my generosity. Someone else asked if their niece could use the hot tub next weekend. That weekend, I woke up to hear voices in my backyard. 3 people were lounging by the pool with drinks, claiming they had a verbal okay from Patty. One of them had the gall to ask if I had sunscreen. I threatened to call the police and they left. That night, I saw movement on the camera feed. A man in a polo shirt with an HOA badge was fiddling with my breaker box. I stepped outside and asked him what in the hell he was doing. He said he was inspecting for code compliance. I said the code he was about to violate was trespassing. He left in a hurry. I emailed everything to the board. Screenshots, footage, timestamps, legal notices. Still no reply. Then came the cherry on top. A notice taped to my door informing me of a $500 fine for violations of cooperative utility policy. I'd had enough. I called my lawyer. My attorney Shauna lives for this kind of absurdity. Within 12 hours, she had a letter sent to the board demanding an immediate cease and desist from all unauthorized access, clarification of property boundaries, and retraction of all false fines. She included photos, legal definitions, and precedent cases. She CC'd the county recorder's office and the HOA's own legal counsel. The response was cricket. That is until I checked my cameras again and saw two board members entering through my side gate at midnight holding flashlights and a clipboard. They stayed for 15 minutes. The next day, I received another violation: excessive nighttime illumination. I posted the footage online in a private neighborhood group with the caption, "New Vampire Initiative from our beloved HO." It got 72 comments and 12 laughing emojis within an hour. That same night, Patricia stood at my gate, arms crossed, watching me from the street as I grilled salmon in the yard. We locked eyes. She didn't speak. She just stared as if waiting for me to break. But I wasn't the one who looked like they were unraveling. Her eyes twitched. Her smile was gone. She turned and walked away. That was the last normal day I had for a week, because the next move she made would bring the police to my doorstep, turn neighbors against each other, and unravel the one thing she cared about more than control, her reputation. It started with the sound of car doors slamming just after sunrise, one after another, as if someone was orchestrating an early morning parade. I pulled back the curtain and counted 5 unfamiliar SUVs parked along the narrow curb across from my gate. People were stepping out in coordinated golf shirts. Most of them holding clipboards or insulated coffee tumblers. They weren't construction workers or tourists, and they sure didn't look like neighbors. I watched one of them plant a yard sign that said, "Welcome executive guests," in sleek black lettering with the HOA logo printed below. Another one unfolded a canopy tent and began setting up what appeared to be a check-in station. I walked out barefoot in sweatpants and a shirt that said, "Not today, Patricia," and immediately locked eyes with a woman I recognized from the HOA's events committee. She smiled awkwardly and turned away like she hadn't just set up a concierge table in front of my house. I crossed the street and asked what was happening. She told me the community was hosting a weekend meet and greet for potential investors in the new eco-village development and that my property had been pre-selected as a hospitality node. I asked what a hospitality node was. She told me it was like an example property to showcase the neighborhood's lifestyle integration. I told her the only thing integrated here was the rising fury in my chest and the urge to flip that table. She offered me a muffin. I declined. By mid-morning, guests began arriving. Dressed in linen shirts and designer sandals. They were given small name tags and maps of the neighborhood. Many of them were handed room keys to various homes that had supposedly been volunteered for demonstration. Mine was on the list. I heard one of the greeters say, "You'll love this one. It's got a private pool, smart blinds, and an incredible sunset view." I said loudly enough for several people to hear. It also has an angry owner and a very fast 911 dial speed. A man with a clipboard approached me and asked if I was the maintenance lead. I told him I was the owner. He blinked, looked at his sheet, then back at me. "Is this not a shared use site?" he asked. I told him it was a shared hell site and that he had 5 minutes to remove his people before I made that clear to every arriving investor with a bullhorn and legal documents. He apologized, said there must have been a miscommunication, and began making calls. 2 hours later, the event was redirected to the HO clubhouse, and I stood on my porch, arms crossed, as vans were loaded and signs were pulled down. Patricia was nowhere in sight, but her fingerprints were all over the operation. Later that evening, I got a knock at the door. It was a neighbor named Kevin, someone I'd always known to be quiet, friendly, the kind of guy who waved while jogging and left Christmas cookies without a note. He looked uncomfortable. He said he'd been on the email thread about the hospitality nodes and that Patricia had specifically listed my house as one of the HOA managed unit. He said her wording was strategic, full of vague references and incomplete footnote. She even attached a scanned document that looked like a community charter amendment. Kevin had grown suspicious and did some digging. Turns out the amendment didn't exist. The page sheet attached was a photoshopped copy of an unrelated easement notice with altered text and forged approval signatures. He'd cross-checked the language with the HOA archives and found nothing. That's when I realized Patricia wasn't just overstepping. She was forging, falsifying documents, presenting altered contracts to third parties. This wasn't an HOA nuisance anymore. This was fraud. Kevin gave me a copy of everything he found and said he was planning to resign from the events committee. He also told me that several other board members were starting to get nervous about Patricia's leadership, but didn't know how to challenge her without evidence. I said I'd handle the evidence. That night, I created a digital archive of every document, email, video, and voice memo I'd collected since this all started. I organized it by date, cross-referenced it with the official bylaws, and had Shauna review it for legal relevance. She called it damning. She said we could pursue charges, but she also had a better idea. Let them bury themselves a little deeper first. She said people like Patricia implode faster when no one stops them. She was right. The next day, I received 3 new violation notices from the HOA. One accused me of unapproved outdoor lighting because I'd installed motion sensor LEDs. Another cited excessive foliage on the west side of my fence, referring to the ivy that's been there since I moved in. The third claimed I had displayed antagonistic signage in public view. I assumed this meant my doormat that said no soliciting unless you're selling tacos. At this point, it was so absurd that I laughed while reading them. But Shauna didn't laugh. She said these were escalation tactics designed to provoke me into reacting emotionally to trap me in a spiral of violation rebuttals and administrative loop. She said we'd respond to none of them and instead prepare something bigger. Meanwhile, Patricia had started spreading a new rumor. She was telling neighbors that I was planning to sell my house and that the board was considering converting it into a permanent guest house for community enrichment. One woman even congratulated me on my move up. Another asked if she could book a week next summer for her cousin's wedding. I started recording these interactions. Every time someone referenced something Patricia had falsely claimed, I took notes, captured audio where possible, and added it to the growing archive. I wanted her web of lies to collapse under its own weight. Then came the barbecue, a full-blown HOA-sponsored block party hosted on the lot next to mine with live music, catered food, and a series of tents that spilled partially onto my property line. When I stepped outside, a DJ was setting up speakers less than 10 feet from my garden. Patricia was there in a sundress, smiling and waving like this was a charity gala. I confronted her in front of everyone and asked her why part of the event was on my land. She laughed, said it was a community alignment misunderstanding, and suggested I loosen up. I told her I'd called the police. Her smile didn't fade. "Do what you need to do," she said, sipping sangria. The police arrived 20 minutes later. When they showed up, I calmly explained that unauthorized persons were on my property, that there were no permits filed for event use, and that I had camera footage of the encroachment. Patricia attempted to argue, saying the HOA had communal jurisdiction over bordering land. But when the officer asked to see the documentation, all she had was a laminated brochure from last year's holiday newsletter. The officer raised an eyebrow. I handed him my deed. He read it. Then he asked Patricia to move the tents off my property. She did not take that well. She began ranting about entitlement and neighborhood vision and how some people just don't understand shared values. The officer calmly repeated the request. She muttered something under her breath and stormed off. It began with music loud and pulsing through the walls like a heartbeat on the edge of panic. I was reading in bed when the floor subtly vibrated beneath me and a thud of bass made my window panes shiver. I looked at the clock. It was 10:14 p.m. I stepped outside into the warm night air and followed the sound around the corner of my fence, expecting perhaps a wild house party next door. What I saw instead made me stop in my tracks. My front yard was bathed in pink uplighting with strings of lanterns swaying in the breeze and valet attendants guiding luxury cars into tight rows along the curb. There was a woman at a podium with a headset microphone gesturing toward a small crowd of guests dressed like they were attending a charity gala. Someone clinked a champagne flute. I heard the word silent auction and nearly choked. They were back. Not the same guests from last time, but the same ridiculous plan in motion, only this time bigger, louder, and completely public. I crossed the yard demanding to know who authorized this and was met with blank stares and nervous apologies. The woman with the headset said she was told by Patricia Delman to host the event here. That my house was the centerpiece of the Community Engagement Initiative. I asked her where she thought she was. She said confused, "Aren't you the new property manager?" I told her I was the owner. Her mouth slowly opened as her hand reached for her earpiece. I stormed inside to find the front door unlocked. People milling through the living room, placing coats on my hooks and laughing in corners like it was a hotel lounge. A man was pouring himself a drink from my liquor cabinet. A woman was sitting at my piano, casually playing something from memory. I demanded everyone leave immediately and told them they were trespassing. Most didn't take me seriously until I began taking pictures. The tone shifted fast. Someone asked, "Wait, is this not part of the venue?" Another woman whispered, "We should call our driver." The living room cleared like I'd pulled the fire alarm. Outside, I could hear the DJ's voice over the mic, welcoming the crowd and thanking our generous property hosts. I called the police. When the officers arrived, the scene was pure madness. Cars lined the street in both directions, blocking driveways and fire hydrant. The officers asked who was responsible for organizing the event, and I pointed them toward the woman with the headset. She immediately tried to deflect, claiming she was only the coordinator and that all arrangements had been handled through the HOA President. Patricia, of course, was nowhere to be seen. One officer asked me to show proof of ownership, so I handed over my ID and a printed copy of the deed. The other officer took a walk through the property with me, and I showed him every space guests had entered from the kitchen to the upstairs guest room, where someone had apparently left a jacket and an open bottle of rose. As we walked back downstairs, we crossed paths with a man in a catering uniform carrying a tray of shrimp. He looked up and said, "Oh, man. Are you the guy whose house this is?" I said, "Yes." He whistled. "Yeah, I thought it was weird you didn't have signs out. She just said it was a sponsored property. We've been staging food here for hours." I asked who she was. He pointed toward the road. "The lady in the blue dress, the one yelling at the DJ." I followed his finger and saw Patricia standing near the sidewalk, arguing with the sound technician, gesturing wildly toward the volume dial and making slicing motions with her hands. I walked straight toward her, flanked by two uniformed officers, and called out her name. She turned, startled, and then immediately switched to her composed public face. "Oh," she said sweetly. "Hello, we're just about done here." "Wonderful turnout, right?" One officer asked her if she had permission to use this address for the event. She started rattling off vague phrases like community access clause and board authorized hospitality, but her voice faltered when the second officer produced my deed and said it clearly indicated private property not subject to communal activity. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "A misfiled venue location." The officer then asked if she had permission to enter the home. She paused. "I had an understanding with the board." She said the officer asked again if she had explicit permission from the property owner, me. I said no. She looked at me, something twitching in her jaw, and then turned to the officer and said, "This is harassment." Her voice raised. "He's doing this to humiliate me. He's trying to make me look unstable." The officer calmly asked her to lower her voice. She didn't. "You don't understand," she snapped. "This property is part of a community network. He's exploiting technicalities. We have alignment rights. This is political." The officer asked her to step aside. She refused. That's when the body cam footage began capturing what I'll call the moment she lost the plot. She began ranting, loud, erratic. Circling back to phrases that didn't connect, entitled enclave logic, property as a public responsibility, architectural flow interference. The officer asked again for her to step back from the crowd. She didn't. She waved her arms, tried to pull out her phone, dropped it, shouted at someone in the catering tent to shut it down, and then muttered that this whole thing was a setup. The officer issued a formal warning. Patricia crossed her arms and said, "You'll regret this." The officers asked her to leave the premises immediately. She refused again. At that point, they told her she would be cited for trespassing if she did not comply. That's when it hit her. Not only was she losing control of the narrative, she was losing it in front of half the neighborhood. A dozen neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk watching the scene unfold. Phones were out. Some were recording. Some were shaking their heads. Someone whispered, "She's completely lost it." Another said, "I thought she had permission." A third, more ominously, said, "I'm calling a board meeting." The officers escorted Patricia off the premises. She didn't resist, but she didn't apologize either. She got into her luxury SUV, slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows, and peeled off into the night. The DJ packed up. The lights were pulled down. The caterers awkwardly boxed up untouched platters. One of the guests came up to me, shaking her head, and apologized for the intrusion. I told her it wasn't her fault. She asked if there would be another open house next month. I said, absolutely not. The next morning, I woke up to find a hand-delivered envelope tucked into my mailbox. Inside was a formal citation from the HOA for violation of community harmony guidelines. It claimed I had created a hostile environment during a scheduled event. The citation referenced aggressive posturing, unapproved audio disturbance, and obstruction of executive HOA operations. I laugh. Then I sent the entire envelope to Shauna. She replied within 10 minutes. One sentence, she's cracked. Watch what happens. 2 days after the police incident, I received an email with the subject line "Special HOA Meeting. Mandatory attendance." No details, no agenda, just a time, a place, and a note that attendance was compulsory for all residents in good standing. I had a feeling I knew exactly what it was about. I forwarded the email to Shauna, who replied with a short message telling me to bring a notebook, a witness, and a calm demeanor. I arrived at the clubhouse 10 minutes early and found the parking lot already half full. People were filing in slowly, murmuring among themselves with that low, humming nervousness that always precedes a public spectacle. Inside, rows of folding chairs had been arranged facing the elevated stage, where the board usually made announcements about pool schedules and lawn height restrictions. But this time, there was no welcoming smile, no hors d'oeuvres, no ambient music, just a room full of stiff necks and sideways glances. Patricia was already on stage, sitting at the long table beside 2 other board members who looked less like colleagues and more like hostages. She avoided eye contact with me as I took a seat in the second row. A few minutes later, the meeting was called to order. Patricia cleared her throat and began with a monotone reading of procedural formalities, moving quickly and avoiding anything that sounded remotely like an apology. Then she dropped the bomb. Due to recent disruptions and violations of cooperative spirit, the board would be considering a temporary suspension of amenity privileges for any resident found in breach of community decorum. She glanced at me during the word breach. Then, without any subtlety, she introduced a motion to revoke my access to shared amenities pending further review of my behavior. The room tensed. A few people whispered. Someone coughed loudly and muttered ridiculous under their breath. I raised my hand and calmly asked to respond. Patricia hesitated, then forced a smile and invited me to speak for 2 minutes. I walked to the front, stood at the small podium meant for budget updates and gardening announcements and calmly unfolded the folder I'd brought with me. I started by thanking everyone for attending. Then I explained exactly what had happened over the last few weeks, point by point, with dates, names, and supporting document. I included the forged documents Patricia had used to trick guests into thinking my property was part of an event venue. I showed the original deed maps and confirmed my lot was fully independent of HOA event jurisdiction. I referenced the multiple trespassing incidents, the fake citations, the recorded threats, and the bodycam footage that had now gone viral online. I even read a brief quote from one of the police officers who called Patricia's behavior deeply inappropriate. I finished by saying that I had not once violated community rules, but that I had, in fact, exercised my right to protect my home from unlawful use. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I simply let the facts hang in the air. There was a beat of silence when I finished. Then someone clapped. It started small, 2 or 3 slow claps, then spread like wildfire. Within seconds, the room was applauding. Patricia tried to give it down, but the sound overwhelmed her. One of the board members beside her leaned away, clearly uncomfortable. When the room finally quieted, Patricia's face was pale. She tried to regain control by calling for a vote, but before she could, a voice spoke from the back of the room. It was Shauna. She had entered quietly and now stepped forward with a stack of envelopes. She introduced herself as my attorney and said that she had prepared cease and desist notices for each board member based on their participation or silent complicity in the violations against me. She also announced that a formal complaint had been submitted to the County Housing Authority citing abuse of power, falsification of records, and targeted harassment. She smiled and handed out the letters like invitations to a very exclusive party. Patricia tried to object, but Shauna cut her off. She said that any attempt to proceed with a punitive vote against me would now be seen as retaliatory and added that she had already spoken to the HOA's insurance provider who seemed very concerned about exposure to liability. The other 2 board members looked like they'd swallowed ice. One of them asked to speak privately. Patricia ignored him. Then something even more unexpected happened. A member of the audience stood up. One of the residents who usually kept to himself and announced that he was submitting a petition to recall Patricia from her role as president. He said he had the signatures of 24 homeowners which met the required threshold. He handed a copy to the board table and said it was time for new leadership. Another neighbor stood up and added that Patricia's behavior had embarrassed the entire community. A third simply asked, "Do we even know how much money she spent without approval?" The meeting unraveled fast after that. Patricia banged the gavel and declared the session closed, but nobody moved. One of the board members stood up and said he was resigning effective immediately. He walked off the stage without another word. Patricia looked stunned. She stood alone, surrounded by papers and whispers as the room dissolved into quiet clusters of conversations. I walked past her on my way out. She said nothing. Her lips moved slightly like she wanted to speak, but no sound came. Her hand trembled as she tried to collect the loose papers in front of her. I didn't stop. I didn't gloat. I simply walked out into the night air and let the door close behind me. Over the next 24 hours, things began to change quickly. The HOA's legal representative, the same one who'd stood behind Patricia for years, formally withdrew from their contract, citing conflict of interest. Word spread that the county was reviewing several years of HOA financial activity. Neighbors began talking more openly about things they'd witnessed. Patricia using HLA funds for personal landscaping, authorizing private dinners under the guise of board meetings, even hiring relatives as consultants. None of it was confirmed yet, but the scent of exposure hung over the neighborhood like wildfire smoke. One morning, I woke to find a plain envelope tucked into my screen door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed apology from one of the board members. He said he'd known what was happening, but had been afraid to speak out. He thanked me for standing up. It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. A few days later, another resident knocked on my door. She was in her 60s. Someone I'd seen gardening, but never spoken to. She handed me a pie and said, "You saved this place. I don't know how you kept your cool, but you did something big." I thanked her and stood on the porch as she walked away. It happened just after dawn when the quiet stillness of the neighborhood was still holding on to sleep and the birds had just begun their daily debate in the trees. My phone buzzed with a message from Kevin that simply said, "Check the news." I sat up in bed and blinked at the screen, barely awake, and followed the link he'd sent. The headline on the local channel's website read, HOA President caught in property scandal meltdown goes viral. Below it was a freeze frame from the police body cam footage. One where Patricia was mid-sentence, arms raised, eyes wide, expression twisted in full meltdown. I tapped play and heard her voice loud and crackling, arguing with officers, accusing me of manipulating property law and ultimately shouting about community vision as she was escorted off my lawn. The video was barely 2 minutes long, but somehow said everything. It didn't need narration. It didn't need commentary. It was raw, real, and painfully damning. And someone somewhere had leaked it to the media. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. Bigger local outlets picked it up. Then national blogs that specialize in suburban drama stories. One platform called it the Great HOA Showdown. Another edited a version with dramatic music and zoom effects, mocking Patricia's collapse frame by frame. By noon, it was on YouTube's trending page. People were commenting things like she really thought she owned the man's house and power tripping. HOA Karen loses it on live mic. I didn't ask who leaked it. I didn't need to. Too many people had witnessed what happened and too many had felt its weight. It was only a matter of time before someone dropped the match. My phone rang nonstop that day. Friends, family, distant acquaintances, and people I hadn't heard from in years were reaching out. Some were amused, others stunned, and a few just called to say, I handled it better than they would have. Even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in over a decade sent a screenshot of a TikTok recap with a comment that read, "Is this your neighborhood or a Netflix pilot?" I stayed inside most of the day, letting the storm blow past, watching as social media turned Patricia into a punchline. It should have felt satisfying, but honestly, it was uncomfortable. As much as she deserved the fallout, I never wanted it to become a circus. Still, there was no stopping it now. The court of public opinion had spoken. That afternoon, Patricia made her first public statement. It came as a pre-recorded video posted to the HOA's website. A stiff, awkward message where she sat in front of a bookshelf with perfectly arranged law books and tried to look composed. She spoke about misinformation, social media hysteria, and how context was being manipulated to villainize her. She didn't apologize. Instead, she framed everything as a misunderstanding and suggested that legal action may be forthcoming, but the damage was already done. The comments were turned off. The message was down within 4 hours. A neighbor later told me the HOA tech consultant had pulled it without permission after it was reported for misleading content. That same night, an anonymous email was sent to residents titled Patricia's Spending Trail. Attached was a spreadsheet with months of expense records allegedly showing questionable purchases from the HOA account, high-end catering, consulting fees with no invoice details, and landscaping charges that matched the work done exclusively on her property. Whether they were real or not, people believed them because by then everyone wanted to. The next morning, a group of residents knocked on my door. They were holding clipboards and folders, not angry, not demanding, but determined. They told me they were forming a transitional committee to oversee the HOA until formal elections could be held. They asked if I'd be willing to speak at the next meeting and explain what really happened from start to finish. I agreed with one condition. I wouldn't make it personal. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to speak louder than any insult ever could. So I spent the next day compiling everything. The emails, the footage, the citations, the architectural lies, the unauthorized parties, the property fraud. I put it all together in a timeline and printed enough copies for everyone. I didn't add commentary. I didn't dramatize it. I just let the facts tell the story. When the meeting finally came, it was standing room only. The clubhouse was packed with residents, even some from the neighboring community who had heard about the saga and came to see it unfold. There were no decorations this time, no refreshments or polite smiles, just chairs, papers, and tired eyes. I stood at the front and walked them through the timeline, page by page, calmly and clearly. At first, the room was silent, but as the story unfolded, how she had misused her position, manipulated documents, hosted guests in my home without consent, and then fabricated violations to cover her tracks. The mood began to shift. People started nodding, murmuring, flipping back through pages to confirm what they just heard. A few looked genuinely shocked. Others, I think, already knew, but hadn't wanted to believe it. After I finished, I stepped back and let the committee speak. They announced that Patricia had been asked to resign immediately and that a full audit of HOA finances was being initiated. They also shared that a third-party management company would temporarily oversee operations while new elections were prepared. Then came the final statement. The HOA would be issuing a formal apology to me in writing and retracting every false citation ever sent to my address. I stood in the corner as it was read aloud, hands in my pockets, listening to words I never expected to hear. Words like regret, correction, and restitution. When it ended, people applauded, not like a show had concluded, but like something ugly had finally been acknowledged out loud. The fallout for Patricia was swift. She was removed from her position by a unanimous vote. A legal review was initiated to determine whether any of her actions constituted criminal misuse of authority. Her house, once the epicenter of every HO event, now sat dark and quiet. Her front lawn overgrown. Her mailbox stuffed with unopened letters. Some said she'd left town. Others claimed she was consulting a lawyer. But no one really knew. And frankly, no one was chasing the answer anymore. The community had moved on. People were planting flowers again, repainting fences, organizing their own block parties without permits or politic. It was like the neighborhood had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. As for me, I went back to the life I had before the madness. I took longer walks. I fixed up the guest room that had been ransacked by strangers. I even sat by the pool again, not to patrol the gate or monitor for unwanted guests, but just to relax. One afternoon, I found a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten note with no name, only 3 words in careful cursive. I was wrong. I didn't recognize the handwriting. It could have been anyone. Patricia, a board member, a neighbor who believed her lies. I folded the note and placed it in a drawer. I didn't need to know who sent it. The silence said enough. The morning the recall ballots closed. There was no parade, no press conference, no last-ditch effort from Patricia to salvage her legacy. There was only silence, the kind of silence that settles in after a storm has passed, but before the sun remembers how to shine again. I stood at my kitchen window, sipping coffee and watching the cul-de-sac like it might twitch or whisper or do anything to remind me of how much chaos had unfolded on this very street. But it didn't. It just sat still. By noon, the results were released. Patricia and 2 other board members had been removed by a landslide. Not even close. The votes hadn't just turned against them. They had rejected them with a kind of unified fury that only comes from betrayal. Turned out that people may have kept their heads down for years, but the second they saw what unchecked power looked like, they remembered they had a voice. The new board was sworn in that same afternoon, composed of people who had once been considered background characters in community affairs. The quiet father who always fixed broken sprinklers without asking. The retired librarian who organized book swaps in the park. The nurse who brought soup to sick neighbors without ever taking credit. People who actually lived here. People who understood what community meant. The first thing they did was issue a formal letter apologizing for the actions of the previous board. It was hand-delivered to every home, including mine, and signed by each new member. In it, they clarified property lines once and for all, attached copies of updated bylaws, and promised transparency moving forward. There were no big promises, just a few pages of calm, responsible language that felt like a cool cloth on a fevered forehead. I read it twice, not because I didn't believe it, but because I needed to see if it felt real, and it did. For the first time in a long time, it did. 3 days later, Patricia received a letter of her own. This one didn't come with an apology or neighborly kindness. It came with a legal header, a demand for restitution for the damages caused by unauthorized use of private property, and a notice of civil action pending. Shauna had prepared everything and filed it quietly. No press release, no media bait, just a clean and efficient case against someone who had tried to rewrite reality. And finally ran out of ink. I didn't celebrate when I got the call. I just said thank you and asked Shauna if she thought it would stick. She said yes. There was too much on record, too many witnesses, too many missteps caught on video and paper. It wouldn't be a fight. It would be an audit of behavior. And Patricia had already written every damning sentence herself. But what truly brought everything full circle was what happened next. One morning, I stepped outside and saw a moving truck in front of Patricia's house. Not the sleek kind used by the rich to transport art or antique furniture. A beat-up rental, boxy and tired, with mismatched wheels and a crooked license plate. Two men in gray t-shirts loaded boxes while a woman barked instructions from the porch. It wasn't Patricia. It was her sister, the one from Arizona. I'd heard whispers that she was staying there trying to help clean up the mess. I didn't speak. I didn't approach. I just watched as every curtain was taken down, every piece of polished control packed away. And then the funniest thing happened. A notification popped up on my phone from a home sharing app. A new listing in my zip code. I clicked it out of curiosity. The house in the listing was unmistakably Patricia's. Same pale green shutters, same aggressively manicured hedges. Only now it was described as a cozy getaway, perfect for digital nomads or small families. I nearly dropped my phone laughing. Her own sister had listed it online. Maybe out of spite, maybe out of desperation. Either way, it was poetic. Later that afternoon, I decided it was time to add one last thing to my property. A small wooden sign tastefully carved and stained to match the porch rails. It didn't say anything dramatic, just 5 simple words: private residence, not for use. I mounted it myself quietly with a screwdriver and a level. As I stepped back to admire the work, a voice behind me said, "I like that." I turned to see Fiona, the first stranger to ever walk out of my shower, thinking she belonged there, standing at the edge of my driveway, holding a bottle of wine and looking genuinely sheepish. I blinked. She smiled, nervous, but sincere. "I just moved back," she said. "My company transferred me again." "I didn't know it was your house, I swear." I didn't even know the full story until it showed up in my feed while I was sitting in an airport. I laughed, not bitterly, not sarcastically, just laughed because it was all so absurd. She handed me the bottle. It was good wine, clearly an apology offering. I took it, nodded, and said, "Next time you're in town, just knock first." She promised she would. The new board followed through quickly on their reforms. Within weeks, all old citations were erased, the absurd fines canceled, and new rules passed to require resident voting on any major HOA decisions. They also introduced a clause that required transparency on financial expenses exceeding a small amount and ensured all property distinctions were clearly marked and publicly recorded. It was like someone had swept out a musty attic and opened a window. People were talking again, friendly again, real again. I saw neighbors repainting their porches together. Someone organized a potluck in the park that didn't require a permission slip or approval process. The sound of laughter, real laughter, returned to the neighborhood. One evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sun go down behind the hills like it always had before everything went sideways. No one was using my pool. No one was organizing secret events on my lawn. No one was trying to redraw the lines of reality. It was quiet, steady, peaceful. I took a sip of wine, Fiona's bottle, now open and breathing, and let the breeze carry away the final remnants of the storm. Not all battles end with applause. Some just end, and that's more than enough. A week later, I received a formal letter from the HOA. Again, this one wasn't about citations or sanctions. It was an invitation. They were forming a new advisory committee focused on homeowner rights and conflict prevention. They wanted me to join. I stared at the letter for a long time. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I knew what it meant. They trusted me now, not as a victim, not even as a symbol, but as a neighbor. I hadn't decided yet whether I would accept. I wasn't sure I wanted to sit through meetings and budgets and procedural debates, but I appreciated the ask. And maybe, just maybe, I'd say yes. Not for revenge, not to wield power, but to make sure no one like Patricia ever tried it again. In the end, this wasn't a story about an HOA president losing her mind. It wasn't about a house or a fence or a wine-soaked stranger. It was about what happens when people forget where their power ends and someone else's begins. It was about boundaries, not just fences or deeds, but personal ones, invisible, but vital. The ones you don't cross unless you're invited. Patricia didn't just cross them. She set up camp, threw a party, and sent out flyers, and she paid the price.